Thank you very much, Avinash. I'm now going to ask Stephany Griffith-Jones to come up and comment. Squeeze past me. Stephany is a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum. She is allegedly the expert on FTTs, a leading light on taxing currency restrictions, author of many papers and books, particularly on national investment banks. So, Stephany.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted and honored to be on this very distinguished panel with John McDonnell and Avinash. I find Avinash a hard act to follow because he's so eloquent. What can I add? But I think it's excellent that there is this very strong commitment now in the UK and from the Labour side of promoting the long-term view for finance. The idea that academics like to call promoting patient capital. And if we want a financial sector that actively serves the real economy, we need to have sufficient finance, it has to be long-term enough, and it has to be, as Avinash said, at reasonable cost. And this will favor basically what we would call the real economy, businesses and workers, to help them increase productivity, to help them make long-term investment, and to therefore boost growth. And what I think is very exciting about the Labour economic program in this field is that it is embracing a package, because you need to walk on two legs. And I think it's great that Labour is tackling both. At one hand, what we're discussing today, you need to curb volatility and short-termism, because it's so damaging to the real economy, including because it increases the risk of causing very costly crises. And therefore, you need a package to deal with that, which includes a financial transaction tax, which is broad, and includes financial regulation, because tax on its own cannot deal with the challenges that we need. It's a very valuable instrument. It starts to tilt incentives, but we need to complement that with sharper instruments like financial regulation, both actually to curb volatility, but also to promote green growth. I think to promote a low-carbon economy, I think it's very important to use financial regulation also for that purpose. And I will argue that even the financial transaction tax has a very important green component, which makes it even more attractive. So we have all this dimension of curbing volatility, which is helped by this financial transaction tax. But secondly, we have the second leg, which is to create and expand institutions and mechanisms which will directly fund the long term. And here, I think it's very important to emphasize the proposal by John McDonnell on a national investment bank, on a transformation fund for infrastructure, which will channel resources which originate particularly from government, but which will also be raised in the markets from institutional investors like pension funds, who will precisely stop churning, but will orient the savings of these institutions to long-term investment in the economy. So I think that doing both is extremely valuable. Curbing volatility, because if you have, for example, public development banks in a sea of speculative finance, they tend to kind of get lost. And on the other hand, if you just curb speculative finance without having an alternative, if you just criticize the private financial sector without providing an alternative, you are also doing an incomplete job. But if you get both measures in, you will have a very powerful, I think, combination to transform the financial sector, as Avinash said, as Stiglitz always says, to serve the real economy. Because the financial sector should be not a bad master, but a good servant. It's instrumental to improve the real economy. And so we need, as I said, mechanisms to curb volatility, but also mechanisms to channel funds for infrastructure, particularly green one, for SMEs. especially in the poorer regions of this country. And that's one of the big advantages of the National Investment Bank, because it will include also regional development banks, particularly in the poorer regions, which have been so disadvantaged and which are also where the votes for Brexit have been highest, because people have felt abandoned. It actually, in some ways, is also could be quite attractive for the financial sector, maybe not from a purely financial aspect of money that goes into their pockets, but in a sense that they will be contributing through their activities in the private sector to build a better economy for the future. And so they will feel, I think, better about themselves. We have to worry about the psychology of bankers, making them happier. So I think that would be quite good. I sort of am thinking for this presentation, I'm thinking that there is really a dream, and that is that we would have a progressive government in the United States, maybe led by somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who knows a lot about finance, or by Bernie Sanders, and we would have a progressive Labour government in this country. And what would be very exciting would be that we would have then the two largest financial centers in the world for things like currency transactions, which are New York and London. And if they both adopted the same kind of measures, for example, a financial transaction tax, currency transaction tax, this would have a powerful impact because it would affect the whole global economy, and I'm sure many countries would follow such a proposal. So I think this would be a very exciting prospect. So I want to just deepen a little bit the analysis on the main problem is, as Avinash so well explained, excess volatility and the link with the risk of crisis. I mean, the bailout of the British banks and financial institutions, plus a major cost to the UK economy, has been estimated by the authors of this paper to be as much as $7 trillion. I think what would be interesting is that an FTT, and we did some estimations in a paper we wrote with Avinash for the European Parliament, that one of the benefits would be that it would actually lead to more growth. Because if you lower the risk of these terribly costly crises, you will in the long term have lower growth. But it will not just increase growth, but it will also improve the quality of growth. So you can have a more inclusive economy and also a more sustainable one in the sense of greener economy. How will it be more inclusive? Amongst the people who are extremely well paid are the people who precisely benefit from churning. For example, several managers of hedge funds earn billions, not millions, billions yearly. And if their earnings are curtailed, and therefore there will be a cascading effect, I think, through the rest of the economy, because high earnings in the financial sector then are reflected in high earnings in other sectors of the economy, then we will have a much more equal distribution. And a more equal distribution will, of course, not just make a fairer society, but will also promote growth. We have here a great Kaletsky expert, and Jan Toporowski. And Kaletsky taught us that aggregate demand goes up when you distribute income from the rich to the poor. And I think that would happen. And secondly, I think if you use the money that you obtain through this tax to increase public spending or to finance the capital of a new investment bank and use that money for increasing investment in the green economy, you will also help to create a more green economy. So it will have other advantages. I think it's important to stress that this is an idea which actually comes from Keynes, but then was developed, as was mentioned by Tobin. But there are many leading economists who have written in favor of this. including progressive ones like Joe Stiglitz, but also mainstream ones like Jeffrey Frankel, the late Peter Kennan, and also people from the markets, or from the private sector, like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and others. So it is not actually such a radical idea. It's such a rich and obvious idea that people who are rational, who want to improve the economy, support it. There was a major study also conducted at the initiative of the French foreign minister, and there was a commission that Avinash and I were involved in, and the conclusion that we looked at different, in great depth, we looked at different modalities of taxing finance, which is actually one of the least taxed sectors of the economy. They don't pay VAT, for example. It's very interesting. And I always wonder whether they don't pay value-added tax because there's so little value added by the finance. So one of the options, for example, the IMF liked, is to have a value-added tax. But after doing all this studying these different options, we concluded that having a financial transaction tax and a currency transaction tax would actually be the best option. So I think one important element that always people say, as Avinash mentioned, is that you will find that people evade it. I think there are two elements. One, that all taxes are evaded. And secondly is that there are, particularly in the modern economy, good ways of avoiding evasion. And one of them is that contracts are just not enforceable if they haven't paid the stamp tax. So if you buy something and you want to make sure that you can sell it without having legal problems, you pay a very, very small tax to get this stamp, as happens in the UK with a tax on shares, and then you ensure that you will be able to actually own the asset and resell it. So that's one very good mechanism. And secondly, these transactions, particularly, for example, currency transactions, go through a central settlement system. You can avoid it, but the benefits of the costs of avoiding it, which is awkward, are vastly bigger, the costs, than the benefits of, the damage you suffer by not going through the central clearing system, which will guarantee that the transactions are properly done, are so large that they're much bigger than the cost of paying an infinitely small transaction tax. And the existence of these electronic markets, which have been used by the private sector and the financial markets, if you like, to speculate more, to increase the speed of speculation, can now be used by governments. Why should only the private sector use the new technology? Why cannot governments use the new technology to help enforce the transaction tax? Finally, this very interesting proposal also talks about taxing commodities. In that sense, I think it's quite innovative, because transactions of commodities are particularly speculative, because as commodities have now become an asset rather than a real good. They're especially damaging, this volatility of commodity prices are especially damaging to poor countries, to developing economies, for example, in Africa, and to emerging economies, because they are major exporters of commodity, and it creates major economic shocks if your commodity is continuously fluctuating, and it therefore affects many of the poorest people in the world. There is another angle which has not often been stressed, and this is that a very large part of the commodities traded are actually fossil fuel assets, oil and natural gas. So that if we have a tax on commodities, we have one additional way, relatively small one, but one additional way of taxing investment and trade of fossil fuels. So in some ways, we can say that this would be a green FTT. And I think that is also an important advantage, that it would be used for the purpose of shaping the economy to provide discouragement of trading of fossil fuel commodities on the commodities exchange. So I think overall there are a number of elements why this proposal, which is broadening the categories of economic categories that would be paying this tax beyond what had been raised in the initial report that Avinash wrote and that has been adopted by the Labour Party in its last manifesto, would have positive effects. I think there may be a slight concern, which is that maybe introducing so many different sectors at the same time may somewhat increase opposition to the tax. So I think there are issues of, if you like, strategy about, or tactics about whether it should be phased or it should be introduced all at the same time. On the other hand, of course, doing it all at the same time will have the advantage that there will be less arbitrage, less avoidance by shifting from one speculative area to another. So I think that may be something that requires a little bit of thought. But overall, I think this is an excellent proposal, and I'm delighted to be here endorsing it.